Hi, my name is Birgitta Stene, and I'm going to be your commentator as you watch Bergman's The Virgin Spring. This film was released in January 1960. The story is set in medieval Sweden and based on a ballad from the 13th or 14th century called Töres Daughter at Vänge. The credits include many names familiar to viewers of Bergman's earlier films, such as Max von Sydow, who played the knight in The Seventh Seal, and Gunnel Lindblom, who appeared as a silent girl in that film. In the crew are such Bergman regulars as the set designer P.A. Lundgren and the editor Oskar Rosander. All in all, the credit list indicates that by now Bergman had formed his own team of actors and crew members, though there are a couple of relative newcomers here, most notably the cinematographer Sven Nykvist and the actress Birgitta Pettersson in the role of Töres' daughter, Karin. The lovely piece of flute music that we just heard on the soundtrack is reminiscent of old Scandinavian folk tunes and hymns. One of the musical sources actually comes from a hymn book in the Dalecarlian village of Skattung, which is one of the locations where the outdoor scenes of the film were shot. The music was arranged by Erik Nordgren, who had orchestrated almost all of Bergman's films from the 1950s. Bergman himself wrote or adapted the text of two songs we shall hear later in the film, one titled In Heaven and the other called The Beggar's Song. While the original ballad was a drama of violence and revenge set in a Christian context, the film script focuses on a tension between old pagan beliefs and a new Christian ethos. Historically speaking, this is not an unlikely dichotomy. Christianity was first introduced into Sweden by missionary monks in the 9th century, but pre-Christian customs lingered on for a long time and often became associated with trolldom. This is definitely suggested in this opening sequence. Here we meet the dark-haired servant girl Ingrid, who incidentally does not appear in the original ballad. Doing her early morning chores, Ingrid blows life in a fire, the ancient symbol of both spirit and destruction. She then invokes the Old Norse god Odin, also called the All-Father and the Omniscient One.
Gudoden kom.
Ingrid is often singled out in a shot through the use of high-contrast lighting, a cinematic style dating back to the silent Swedish cinema, and wooden support beams are often photographs as if to frame her and close her in, a painful reminder that she is trapped in her life and has no way to escape. Ingrid's invocation of Odin is intercut with a scene where we see Karin's parents kneeling before a Christian crucifix. Töre, the father and husband, seems to say his prayer without much enthusiasm. His wife Merita, performed by Birgitta Wahlberg, a well-known actress from Sweden's Royal Dramatic Theatre, is, contrary to her husband, a devout believer who pours hot candle grease over her wrist as an act of atonement. The script stresses Merita's ascetic bearing and emphasizes her clothing as tight and covering her hair. If we juxtapose Ingrid calling on a pagan god and Merita mortifying her body to express her faith, we can see a pattern reminiscent of a medieval morality and miracle play, in which faith and heresy, good and evil, virtue and vice constituted the moral action.
Din stackare.
Notice also that the opening sequence includes this brief scene in which an older servant woman, who is kind to everyone except Ingrid, is cuddling a group of young chickens. Aside from being a realistic farm vignette, the chicken scene functions as a symbolic reinforcement of the basic theme in the film, that of innocence and the loss of it.
Kunde åtminstone passa mjölkningen, inte bry dig mer om sängen. Men där fick jag flänga omkring ensam med mina arma ben. Jesus Maria, så du ser ut. Vad är det?
Gunnar Lindblom performs this sequence in a slow, deliberate manner, emphasizing Ingrid's heavy body, big with child. Ingrid has conceived out of wedlock, and this is an all too visible stigma. Having lost her virginity without being married makes her a sinner in the context of 14th century Christian morality. But there are indeed some psychological loose ends here. We do not know if Ingrid's pregnancy is the result of a rape, which would stress the vulnerability motif in the film and foreshadow the fate of Karin, or if Ingrid's present state is the result of her having been tempted to transgress Christian morality. Ingrid and Karin are clearly presented as opposites in terms of their social status. And perhaps one of the ironies of their different prospects in life is that in the end, they nevertheless share the same destiny in that they both have their physical integrity as women violated.
Du får rida till kyrkan med Maria ljuset.
Ska jag rida?
Ja.
Men skulle inte Karin rida nu på morgonen?
Karin är inte frisk idag. Hon sover bort ottesången, sen blir hon väl frisk igen.
We can assume that it seems very unseemly to a devout woman like Merita and adds to her anger when Ingrid taunts her about her daughter Karin and her dancing the night before. Since Ingrid is Karin's foster sister, Merita cannot ignore her. We don't know how the relationship between Ingrid and Karin came about, and the script offers no explanation. To be a foster sister or foster brother dates back to Viking times and does not necessarily imply a biological relationship. It was more a bond of friendship, which was sealed in blood, as two persons would cut a small wound on their bodies and mix the blood. It was meant to be a lifelong bond. We have to assume that Ingrid and Karin are insolubly tied together. The careful introduction of Ingrid asking Woden to put a curse on her foster sister is off-balanced by this scene of a morning meal in the main hall presided over by Ture and his wife. Though it's hard to discern, Ture's high seat is adorned with two figures of saints. This is a contrast to a later scene in the film where we meet an old man in the forest cabin who is a worshipper of Odin and whose high seat is decorated with pagan idols and secret markings. Notice also that the composition of the meal in Ture's hall suggests familiar old paintings of Christ's Last Supper. A similar meal scene will be repeated one more time in the film. On the whole, meals are always important rites in Bergman's filmmaking. You may recall, for instance, the luncheon that old Isak Boy shares with his travel companions in Wild Strawberries, or the dinner sequence in The Hour of the Wolf, attended by Johan and his wife. Fanny and Alexander opens and closes on a sumptuous and happy family meal, in contrast to the meager fare offered in the bishop's household.
Skicka nu Ingrid och väcka Karin.
Jag går själv.
Bergman had read and been fascinated by the ballad of Ture's daughter at Venge as a student in the early 1940s. But when he tried many years later to transform the 32-stanza ballad into a film script, he had difficulties and turned to novelist Ulla Isaksson, who had been a scriptwriter for the film Brink of Life in 1958. Isaksson changed the ballad into prose fiction, after which she and Bergman worked together on the final film script. Bergman asked for Ulla Isaksson's collaboration because he wanted to objectify his response to the original ballad and establish a distance to a story. The film narrative includes no flashbacks and proceeds in a straightforward, sequential manner. The camera work aims at recording rather than interpreting, and is often quite still. Together with the slow acting pace, it gives the film an almost static quality. But this was Bergman's aim in his attempt at presenting the story as a stylized medieval morality play, a genre he had been drawn to since his younger days when many of his own dramas were conceived in that way. In this scene, Ingrid discovers a live toad on the floor and is tempted to put it in a loaf of bread that Karin will bring with her later. In ancient Scandinavian folklore, toads were thought to be the devil in disguise. Troll women who had sex with the devil were said to give birth to toads. In the Middle Ages, toads were used as hosts in witch sabbaths. Toads and frogs are represented in medieval drawings as a metamorphosed uterus and were given special sexual power. Given these folklore allusions, Ingrid's act becomes more than a nasty gesture directed at her privileged foster sister. It also points to her own illicit pregnancy, for with her tousled dark hair, her spiteful appearance, and her sloppy attire, Ingrid looks like a troll hag. The toad is also a premonition of the rape of Karin by the brutish shepherds, one of whom wears a Mephistophelian-like goat beard.
Jag kan väl få morgonbiten på sängen.
Both foster sisters seem typecast. Gunnar Lindblom had played a silent farm girl threatened by rape in The Seventh Seal, and Birgitta Pettersson had appeared in Bergman's previous film, The Magician, as the scared servant girl Sanna, who is comforted by her old herb-collecting granny. There is certainly a resemblance between Sanna's innocence in The Magician and her role in The Virgin Spring, but this was to be her only major part in a Bergman film. Unlike Bibi Andersson, who was also given ingenue roles in her early work for Bergman, but was offered the opportunity to broaden her screen register, for instance as the nurse Alma in Persona, Birgitta Pettersson's part as Karin in The Virgin Spring was her only major assignment for Bergman. Her only other appearance was a small part in his 1997 TV film In the Presence of a Clown.
Så blir jag glad. Och så blir du glad. Och så blir far glad. Mor. Jag ska rida så värdigt i kyrkan. Du ska få se.
As opposed to Bergman, who was more interested in the stylization of the old ballad, Ulla Isaksson seems to have been more concerned with providing a psychological framework. In a note to her revision of the old ballads, she states the necessity to provide motivation for the characters, and by doing so, to transcend the abstracted presentation of them in the old ballad. The film must, she writes in a prefatory note, the film must, in quite another manner, make the story of young Karin and her parents realistically understandable, credible as to continuity, psychology, and milieu. The sequence in young Karin's bedroom is a case in point. Karin is being dressed to ride to church to offer candles to the Virgin Mary, a ceremony that must be performed by an innocent maiden. We might for a moment juxtapose the dressing ritual in the old ballad with its elaborate counterpart in the film. In the ballad, Karin's wardrobe serves mainly to establish her high social status, as in the following 4 stanzas. Noble Karin sits upon her bed, plaiting her golden locks about her head. Noble Karin dons her silken robe, a work of 15 maidens sewed. Noble Karin dons her petticoat fine, richly embroidered with golden twine. Noble Karin dons her blue cloak bright. She rides to church, now it is light. In the film, on the other hand, Karin, who has overslept the morning meal and early mass, is obviously more interested in her own appearance than in her religious task, and her manipulative coyness and vanity gives her a non-spiritual quality. It is condoned by her indulgent mother, who gives in to her daughter's will and allows Karin to wear her long blonde hair loosely hanging over her shoulders. Märta knows fully and well Just take a look at her headgear. She knows that exposing an abundance of hair was usually reserved for secular festivities and not on religious occasions. And yet, at the same time, this blonde maiden appears in looks like a stylization of purity, set up to contrast against the morose and earthy Ingrid, who has lost her innocence.
Jag skulle också vilja drömma. Stora, underbara drömmar. Men aldrig händer det mig.
The Virgin Spring was released in early 1960 and comes at midpoint in Bergman's long career, which includes more than 50 screen works and TV films. It is preceded by such major titles as The Seventh Seal, Wild Strawberries, and The Magician, and is followed by the so-called chamber films of the 1960s, such as a trilogy, Through a Glass Darkly, Winter Light, and The Silence, as well as Bergman's masterpiece, Persona. But The Virgin Spring really marks the last time that Bergman will set his films in an historical setting. In many respects, The Virgin Spring forms more than just a chronological transition between the early and late Bergman, however. It provides a link to his central films of the 50s, between The Naked Knight up to The Magician, sharing with them a setting in the past, a narrative form built around a crucial journey, and a slow, at times stylized pacing.
Ser jag sjuk ut, tycker du? Så blek och så tärd och så sjuk.
Är det skick och fason det, sova över sol?
Och far, när jag kommer till kyrkan ska jag kyssa mäster Eriks hand och be så ödmjukt om förlåtelse för att jag inte hann till Ottosången.
Spoiled Karin also uses her charm to appease her angry father, so that his planned upbraiding of her late morning habits and missed prayer are transformed into a fairy tale tete-a-tete. Ture thereby reinforces Karin's childish character traits, which will later provide unwitting encouragement to the rapists as they listen to her bragging fantasies about her noble blood and the golden jewels she possesses to embellish her neck.
Sätt henne i berget i 7 år, så hon blir stark. Sen kommer jag och hämtar henne. Kanske.
Carrying his daughter outside, Ture will pass the old servant woman who is talking to a beggar or vagabond, played by Allan Edwall, the actor who was to appear as the crippled churchwarden in Winter Light and as Oscar, the Ekdal father, in Fanny and Alexander. Often in Bergman's films, Edwall was given a philosophical role full of wry humor. In The Virgin Spring, he represents a messenger from the outside world who has traveled about and can tell of beautiful churches in foreign lands, built of limestone and stained-glass windows, a reference that points forward to Ture's later promise to build exactly such a church to atone for his deeds. The contrast between the two foster sisters is again stated at the time of their ride to church. While Karin is carried to her horse in her father's arms, Ingrid, on the other hand, is seen plucking a chicken. As Karin says goodbye to her parents seated on her horseback, a clear dividing line is established between father and daughter on one hand and Ingrid and Märta on the other. Märta is snubbed by Karin, who refuses her a farewell kiss and teasingly places her finger on her mother's forehead. Märta watches the affectionate farewell kiss between Karin and her father, and saddened and jealous, she goes over to Ingrid. The two of them have, for a moment, both become rejected outsiders. Ingrid's resentment of Karin was, as we have seen, established already in the opening sequence of the film. Now it will come to a head as the two women set off together on their ride to church. The sequence is important not only from a psychological but also from a cinematic point of view, for this is the first time in the film that we are taken outdoors beyond the farmhouse. What we now see is a piece of traditional Swedish cinematography dating back to the silent era of filmmaking, when high-contrast lighting of interiors of the kind we saw in the opening sequence was juxtaposed to an outdoor pastoral landscape characterized by white cumulus clouds, lush meadows, and glittering lakes, often framed by birch trees. Dalecarlia, the actual setting of the Virgin Spring, epitomizes this kind of landscape. Gunnar Fischer, who was Bergman's cameraman during most of the 50s, was trained in this school of cinematography, which suited his lyrical temperament. In that sense, it is as if he, rather than the more robust Sven Nykvist, had photographed the Virgin Spring. Nykvist would shoot all subsequent Bergman films up to and including Fanny and Alexander, but in The Virgin Spring, his presence points forward in name only. His collaboration with Bergman did not really result in a photographic style of his own until the making of Through a Glass Darkly in 1961, when the starkness of Fårö Island emerged as Bergman's geographic and symbolic setting, and Nykvist began to develop a lighting technique that produced shadowless, grayish tones rather than high contrast shots, something that became possible to do with the appearance of new high-speed film. When the two women ride through the forest, their different characters and status again become clear. Ingrid sits heavy and slumped on her horse, while Karin is photographed as if she were a princess on her stallion. Karin becomes an integral part of the beautiful landscape as she rides along the sun-filled birch trees. This type of setting had given rise to a particular native genre, the summer film, in which the landscape came to epitomize freedom, ephemeral happiness, young love, and peace of mind. We should note that this marks the last time that Bergman used music composed specifically for a film. In subsequent works, he would only include existing music, usually fragments from Bach, Schubert, or Schumann.
Du får väl se själv en gång hur lätt det blir.
Då är jag gift till lås och nycklar och heder och husfrudöme.
Du får väl se hur du går med heden, när en man talar runt midjan eller stryker över halsen.
En man får aldrig med i sängen, utan att vi är gifta.
Och om du möter en i hagen om kvällen, de lägger omkull där bakom en buske.
Då slår jag mig fri.
Men han är starkare.
On their ride, Ingrid and Karin also run into the farmhand that Karin has danced and flirted with the evening before, and who might be the father of Ingrid's child.
Ska du till Ottesången så kommer du för sent. Men det är bättre att du pryder vägen än du bleknar i kyrkan.
Jag ska till kyrkan med Maria-ljusen.
Aha, jag förstår det, till din heliga moderns ära. Du har klätt och smyckat dig. Som en brud för sin brudgång, va?
It might seem somewhat peculiar that a girl of Karin's special high status would consort with a farmhand, almost as if she were a young Miss Julie, the noblewoman in Strindberg's play, who has an affair with a servant. Another strange feature in the story is that Karin is allowed to ride through the forest without a protecting entourage. Such travels were notoriously dangerous because of the risk of highway robbery. There is indeed a peculiar discrepancy in the film between the care taken to reproduce an authentic 13th century milieu and the failure at times to provide believable historical situations for the characters.
Du log mot honom. Du dansade vid hans hand.
Jag dansade med alla som räckte mig handen.
Ingrid does not belong in Karin's romantic setting. Soon she will stay behind and enter the old man's cabin in the forest, while her foster sister would not think for a moment to join her there. Before Ingrid enters, there is a single shot of a huge raven juxtaposed to the old man, who is a worshipper of Odin. Odin was said to learn his wisdom from two ravens who whispered into his ears what they had seen and heard when flying around Earth. The raven as Odin's special emblem appears twice in the film in close-ups. The second time towards the end of the film when Ture and his household are searching for the spot where Karin was raped and killed. The raven becomes an ill omen, a reminder of the evil and primitive forces that undermine Christian morality. The cabin of the old man is situated by a brook. It forms a kind of boundary for his visitors, who, if they cross the shaky walking bridge across the brook, enter into a strange and frightening world. In old mythologies, waterways often signify transitions into unknown realms. One is reminded here of Charon, the old ferryman in Greek mythology, who helped the dead across the water to the realm of death.
Är småjungfrurna rädda för skogen?
Jag är inte rädd. Jag rider till kyrkan. Kan hon inte få vila sig lite i din stuga och vänta där till jag kommer tillbaka? Se här, det räcker åt er båda. Du trodde väl inte att jag tänkte slå dig en gång till?
The original story about the miraculous healing spring first originated in the Romance languages and existed in many versions before coming to the Nordic countries, but it was there it took on the clear character of a Christian legend. As such, it probably also helped promote and solidify the new faith. It is certainly worth noting that in the ballad about Ture's daughter at Venge, there is no mention of pre-Christian customs and no reference to the Old Norse gods or to sacrifices associated with them. We know that the earliest church buildings, the so-called stave churches, which are still standing in parts of Scandinavia, had ornamentation that referred back to pagan times, such as carved dragon heads of the kind that used to decorate the Viking ships. It seems that in many cases, the symbols and artifacts of older pre-Christian worship were incorporated into the new religious practices. But we also know that many Swedes who studied in the Middle Ages at cathedral schools and universities on the European continent, that they had to endure insults that they were descendants of Vikings and barbarians from the wild north. And as was mentioned earlier, Swedish folklore about trolls and witches often became associated with old pagan forces in the Old Norse culture, even long after the actual sacrificial practices honoring Odin and the other Asa gods had ceased.
Hör vad människan viskar i lönndom och ser vad hon tror att ingen ser. Du kan höra själv.
Isaksson decided to incorporate some of the pagan customs and old folklore myths into the film to amplify the story of the old ballad. So she added Ingrid to her script as a kind of folktale figure, the evil stepsister who is a threat to her, the heroine, the innocent Karin. But she could not present her as an actual troll woman, for the story of Karin's rape and murder is too realistic for that. Instead, she connected Ingrid with an older form of religion, the Viking or pagan worship of Odin, and she provided her with a would-be soulmate, the old man in the forest cabin who had made sacrifices to Odin. Add in Ingrid and the old man, who is a kind of seer or shaman, to the old ballad provides a dramatic contrast to the Christian context of the film and to its real climax, the miraculous welling up of the Virgin Spring. The addition also becomes part of a basic thematic dichotomy in the film between innocence and evil, though innocence is tainted by vanity in Karin's case and evil thoughts are tempered by guilt in Ingrid. The moral contrast between them is not absolute, but their differences are nevertheless very clear, as we have already seen, in terms of clothing, social status, and physical looks. Ingrid has her hands folded around the pagan head that adorns the old man's high seat. She seems both fascinated and repelled by him as he shows her his relics, until he touches her body, obviously lusting for it.
Det ska det inte vara. Jag ska ge dig styrka.
Ingrid's flight from the old man's cabin is indeed an escape from something deadly. Her fear before the danger she has faced is conveyed in the rapid tracking scene where she runs and stumbles through the ensnaring underbrush. The cinematic style in this scene reminds us of Bergman's statement that at the time of making The Virgin Spring, he was much intrigued by Kurosawa's samurai films. The tracking shot is an obvious imitation of Kurosawa's Rashomon. If you juxtapose this scene with one of Karin riding in slow, stately pace along the shore of the lake, you can see a representation of two very different film styles, one a traditionally Swedish, the other a Japanese borrowing. The Dalecarlia setting carried a special personal meaning for Bergman. It was there that his maternal grandmother had had her summer residence. Dalarna was in many ways Bergman's early retreat. It was the place where he began to write when on leave from his military draft. In other words, Dalarna was where he started to define his future role as an auteur. How deeply attached Bergman was to the region, both in a personal and creative sense, is suggested by an incident that occurred during the shooting of The Virgin Spring. The crew was working with rather cranky old devices, and everyone had to help out with ropes, cables, and lamps. The weather was cold with rain and even snowflakes in the air, but suddenly a break appeared in the clouds. The wind stopped and the sun burst through. Everyone looked upwards, and above the tops of the pine trees they could see two cranes soaring in their majestic flight. Everyone dropped what they were doing and raced up to the crest of a small hill above the stream in order to get a better view of the birds in flight, until the cranes flew off to the west and disappeared over the extensive forest and blue mountains in the distance. Enchanted and invigorated by this experience, Bergman reflected on an offer that he had just received from an American company. It would be great to have $150,000, and it would be very pleasant to have a camera track that was not buckled, a camera truck that does not creak, and it would be quite an event just for once to make a motion picture with a budget of over $250,000, just for the experience. However, despite all that, I'm turning the American offer down flat. I felt a sudden happiness and relief. I felt secure and at home.
Vem tar hand om er då?
Vi vallar i skogen, sover på tuvan, dricker ur träsket, drar rötter ur jorden.
Ingrid's flight from the lusting old man may be juxtaposed to Karin's foreboding meeting with the three goatherds, which will culminate in her being raped and killed. The herdsmen are a great deal more individualized than in the original ballad, where they are conceived as an abstracted group. One is very lean and talkative, another is tongueless and inarticulate, the third is a teenage boy. The aim of this characterization was, according to Ulla Isaksson, to create pathos around the murderers. She writes, "The three criminals are not totally evil. On the whole, we emphasized that the spectators have pity for all the people in the film." In comparison to the medieval ballad, the film does include a number of psychological elements, such as marital tension, envy, and emotional competition. But there may also be personal reasons behind some of the motifs in The Virgin Spring. The year 1959, when The Virgin Spring was made, was the beginning of a critical, though productive period in Bergman's life. On the private level, he lived a kind of double existence. The concert pianist Käbi Lairetai became his fourth wife, but he also had an affair and conceived a daughter with Ingrid von Rosen, the woman he was to marry many years later in 1971. His paternity was not made known officially until 2003, almost a decade after Ingrid's death. It seems likely that withholding his paternity and suppressing any moral qualms he might have felt at the time could have fueled the illicit pregnancy motif in The Virgin Spring. Another connection between Bergman's personal and professional worlds around 1960 can be found in a religious crisis which he explored creatively in The Virgin Spring and in the subsequent trilogy made between 1961 and 1963. When he announced the making of The Virgin Spring, he referred to it as the first work in a set of 3 films on a similar theme. But after completing Through a Glass Darkly, he chose that work to be the initial part of a trilogy. There may be several reasons for this change. The Virgin Spring was to meet with severe criticism both at home and abroad, even though it won an Oscar as Best Foreign Film. It caused Bergman to lose his undisputed status among cineasts in France and the United States, who had originally promoted him as a leading auteur du cinéma. Perhaps he feared that some of the bad publicity around The Virgin Spring would make the reviewers prejudge Through a Glass Darkly if it were promoted as linked to the earlier film. But the most likely reason for shifting the trilogy concept after the completion of Through a Glass Darkly is to be found in the fact that in cinematic form, narrative style, and setting, the chamber film does not have much connection with the medieval world and rhetoric of The Virgin Spring. And yet, the motto Bergman provided to the trilogy seems also to hark back to the ending of The Virgin Spring. The theme, he writes, in the published version of the trilogy, is a reduction in the metaphysical sense of the word. Through a Glass Darkly represented certainty achieved, certainty, that is, of God's presence, as both a sign of love and as a negative presence, a cruel God. It is an ambiguity that is also expressed in The Virgin Spring, in which the father Töre cannot understand a God who would permit the rape of his daughter Karin, yet promises at the same time to build a church on the spot where the murder took place. The motif carries over into Bergman's film from 1961, Through a Glass Darkly, where God himself becomes the rapist of a young woman whose name is also Karin. Together with the explicit sexual scenes in the silence, the rape sequence in The Virgin Spring became the most debated and controversial one in Bergman's entire filmmaking, and a test case for film censorship in Sweden. A public request that the Swedish Attorney General examine the rape sequence was denied. There were rumors that Ingmar Bergman had threatened to withdraw his film if any cuts were made, but this has been denied by the Swedish Board of Film Censorship. The rape sequence has a far more emotional impact on us than the corresponding lines in the original ballad, which read, "First she was 3 herdsmen's wife, then she gave up her young life. They took her by the golden lock, and placed her against a birch tree stalk. They severed then her lovely head, a spring welled up upon that stead." But as one Swedish reviewer of The Virgin Spring remarked, the film could have made Karin's death much more gory, had it followed the mutilation mentioned in the ballad. Also, since the making of The Virgin Spring in 1960, viewers have been exposed to far more graphic renderings of sexual violation on the screen than Bergman's presentation of Karin's rape and murder. So why do we still feel so disturbed by this scene? Perhaps details other than graphically explicit ones play a part in our reaction. One such detail is the focus on Karin's entrapment as she becomes framed on all sides by the men accosting her. Another important feature is Bergman's particular stylistic predilection for having the camera oscillate between close-ups and distant shots, between viewer intimacy and voyeurism, so that the spectator becomes both participant and observer, both an insider and an outsider. The pull between these contrasting positions creates a particular tension. Bergman also provides the viewer stand-in with Ingrid, hidden behind a slight embankment, watching the rape scene with us, horrified yet passive. The rape scene is also painful and disturbing to us because of the soundtrack. When a brutish act is committed on the screen, we are used to hearing high shrills and loud cries, perhaps accompanied by dramatic music. Here, the victim is virtually silent until the rape is completed. When she gets up, she lets out a few sounds, like a wounded, yelping dog. Perhaps her violation takes such a strong hold on us because Karin's dehumanization is so complete. She is reduced to a defenseless small animal. Then she's clubbed like a seal cub. In her last moments of consciousness, her eyelids are twittering like a dying bird's. While still alive, Karin was either coddled by people who loved her, or she moved along on horseback with a sense of pride. The setting gave her space. The camera would pan the wide expanse of the landscape she traversed. Now, after her death, her body is framed and confined by dark tree branches. The camera exposes the two rapists as background figures, but busy extending the violation of Karin into a theft of her clothes and culminating in a blasphemous act when they stomp on the spilled candles meant for the Virgin Mary. The youngest brother, the boy, is left behind to guard the goats. He is another outcast, and is ill-treated by his brothers. There's an interesting difference here between the description of him in Isaksson's script and Bergman's film. In the script, the boy participates in the rape by sitting on Karin's breast, but in the film, he is set apart, though still an onlooker. Suddenly, it begins to snow. The flakes are late, unexpected spring flurries, almost a kind of Shakespearean weather change, where all nature is affected by an evil deed. Children in Bergman's works are often observers and sometimes catalysts in the sense that they initiate a story. Such is the case with the boy Johan in The Silence, and the boy played by the same actor who opens the main section of Persona. And, of course, Alexander in the film that bears his name is the most clear example of the pivotal importance of a child in providing a narrative focus to a Bergman screenwork. The boy begins in this sequence to emerge as a witness to both the rape and its aftermath. His first impulse after he's left behind at the rape scene is to feed himself with remnants of the meal on the ground. But shocked by the violation he has seen, he reels over in a violent fit of nausea and vomits, as he will do later during the supper in Töre's house. Before he leaves, the boy tries to cover up Karin's body. Maybe he wants to protect it from the weather. Maybe he wants to hide it so that he can forget it. Or maybe he's performing his own kind of ritual burial, consecrating the ground where Karin was killed. In the adaptation of the ballad, Isaksson describes his behavior as an act of anger. The Virgin Spring marked the end of a period of l'Angmartolatrie in France and of treating Bergman as a cinematic icon. The critique also spread to Sweden. The consensus was that with The Virgin Spring, Bergman had carried his stylized costume films from the 50s to a dead end and had failed to pursue the realistic mode of such earlier works as Summer with Monica and Close to Life. There were also charges that in arranging brutally murdered people in such exquisitely aesthetic settings, Bergman displayed a lack of artistic integrity. The charge of aestheticizing a tragic event harks back to an old literary debate in Sweden with roots in Strindberg's challenge of romantic art some 80 years earlier, when advocates of naturalism called for a new realistic art that chose authentic, ugly settings and a realistic style to convey themes depicting a life in pain and squalor. The meticulous composition of many central scenes in Bergman's filmmaking, such as the chess vignette in The Seventh Seal, the Pietà scene in Cries and Whispers, or Töre's struggle with a single birch tree in his preparation for revenge in The Virgin Spring, scenes which can be singled out as emblematic of Bergman's filmmaking. Such carefully composed scenes have been said to contradict or overshadow the moral content of his work. One could in fact argue that Bergman's pictorial talent became a questionable asset to many of his viewers in the social conscious cultural circles that began to gain ground in Sweden and in France in the 1960s and 1970s. It is hardly a coincidence that a disavowal of Bergman's filmmaking started with The Virgin Spring, which premiered at a time when the new wave of filmmakers, led by Jean-Luc Godard, began to dominate the cinema. This was a trend that quickly gained ground in Sweden. Spearheaded by filmmaker Bo Widerberg, the critique was to include not only The Virgin Spring, but most of Bergman's films of the 1960s, and would not change until the appearance of the TV film Scenes from a Marriage in 1973. Bergman himself was quite critical of The Virgin Spring, or has been so in retrospect, claiming that he and Ulla Isaksson seduced each other into believing that they were creating a moving feature film. Let's not forget that Bergman has often been very sensitive and receptive to negative criticism of his work, and has at times taken over a reviewer evaluation of a film when discussing it afterwards. But it is certainly remarkable that in his book Bilder, Images, where Bergman talks about a select number of his films, he does not even mention The Virgin Spring. And in the interview book Bergman on Bergman, he says point blank, "I want to make it quite clear that The Virgin Spring must be regarded as an aberration." He calls its motivation all bogus and feels that Max von Sydow's acting is on the verge of parody. Certainly, it is at times hard to disagree here, especially when watching Töre's appearance as he faces the goatherds after they arrive at the gate to his farm. We saw him standing there in front of them in his peculiar helmet-like headgear and big fur coat, and he looks like a cartoon Viking or a cinema Prince Valiant. Bergman is apparently responsible for this, but there is no reference in the Isaksson story to Töre receiving the goatherds in such a ceremonial fashion. Invited in to share the supper, the goatherds are seated at the table in a composition reminiscent of the breakfast scene in the early part of the film, but projected as a more pronounced travesty of Christ's Last Supper. There is not one but two Judases around the table, and the focus changes from Töre's central figure to that of the goat-herding boy.
Du är det levande bröd som från himmelen kom.
Throughout the sequence, it is his point of view that is stressed. It is he who recognizes the grace that Töre says as being the same one that Karin recited at the meal in the forest. It is he who registers the faces around the table, obviously seeing them as threatening and accusing. And it is the boy who draws everybody's attention when he vomits and spills his food on the table. Later, he is a frightened and helpless observer of the room from his straw bed. It is the child who becomes the Christ-like figure here. The religious connotations built into the supper sequence alerts us to the fact that Christian allusions in Bergman's filmmaking became a bone of contention to his Swedish critics, who spoke about his Christian hangover. The thought content in The Virgin Spring constitutes an extension of the metaphysical problems that Bergman had raised in The Seventh Seal. But these issues were considered passé in Sweden, a country that prided itself on being a modern secular society. The Virgin Spring confirmed the view that Bergman presented issues that might have been of great concern to his grandparents, but hardly to his own post-war generation. The fact that The Virgin Spring took place in a medieval rather than contemporary setting became indicative of its obsolescence. A new generation of Swedish filmmakers now attacked Bergman's filmmaking for focusing on what was called vertical themes, that is, films that delved into the psyche of the characters rather than horizontal films or works that depicted social problems in the outside present-day world. Above all, there was a feeling that a Bergman film like The Virgin Spring perpetrated an unfortunate myth about what was the essence of northernness, a gloomy, introverted culture filled with angst and despair. When The Virgin Spring was released abroad, Bergman had long since established himself internationally as a filmmaking philosopher, a directeur de conscience, or a moral voice. But The Virgin Spring resulted in a revaluation of Bergman's filmmaking, especially in France, where his former admirers in the Cahiers group of critics, people like Jean-Luc Godard, François Truffaut, and Éric Rohmer, now dismissed The Virgin Spring as a sign of decline, indicating to them that Bergman's filmmaking reputation had been nothing but a passing fad. One of his former fans, Jean Daumarchis, wrote, "Our Bergmania will now pass like the Scooby-Doo and the hula hoop." Nevertheless, The Virgin Spring received an Academy Award as Best Foreign Film in 1960. But all in all, it was a film that caused a great many divergent opinions. It did well at the box office, but perhaps the reasons for this were sensationalist rather than aesthetic. The public flocked to see the rape sequence. But the rape sequence is not the culmination of the film. It occurs midway into the film and functions as a catalyst to shift our attention to Töre, Karin's father, who is the real protagonist in the story. The supper and subsequent revenge sequences are central here and raise more subtle issues than the murder of Karin. The Virgin Spring was an expensive venture, and though Bergman was well known as a prominent auteur abroad and his films were distributed to a great many countries, his producers were sometimes reluctant to approve a budget above the ordinary. At the same time, Rumors circulated, both abroad and in Sweden, that Bergman's film projects were always given priority and financial support. And yet, as late as in 1971-72, his film Cries and Whispers had difficulties finding economic backing. On that occasion, Bergman's cast finally staked their own salaries to help secure financial guarantees for the film.
Ser du röken darrar där uppe? Takhålet.
The scene we are going to watch now, a scene reminiscent of the Granny and Sanna scene in The Magician, where an older wise storyteller recites a fairy tale to a young girl, a tale that has the quality of a legend. In a scene reminiscent of this, the beggar in the Virgin Spring intones a strange story of a quest past purgatory-like obstacles towards a place of rescue. A hand will grasp you, says the beggar, and an arm will be placed around you, and you will be taken far away where evil can no longer harm you. The boy first seems frightened by the beggar's story, but soothed by it at the end. He seems to absorb it into his being and in a way reenacts it for us by his reaction. This ability to understand something intuitively and to perceive something on a childlike, symbolic level is often characteristic of Bergman's child characters. We may think of Alexander again when he listens to the Jew Isaac's reading about the desert walk in his Bible in the longer TV version of the film. There the adult reads, the child sees.
Sist ska du stå framför ett berg av fasa. Det sprutar eld som en ugn och vid dess fot öppnar sig ett hiskligt svalg. Alla slags färger flammar där. Koppar och järn, blå vitriol och gul svavel.
The close-up that has become his particular signum is something that was said to culminate with persona, but actually he had used it all along. It's very early in his career. In fact, in a film called Prison, he discovers the close-up. And this discovery was then reinforced when he watched his first program on television, something which he did down in southern Sweden when he was a director at the Malmö City Theatre. And Sweden didn't have television at the time, but Denmark did. One day he was out walking and he came to a shop window and he saw this TV set in the window and he saw a man playing the piano. He couldn't hear anything. He just saw the picture. And he said, you can't do that. You can't mutilate a body like that. You could see the hands moving across the keys, but it is exactly what he has been doing, developing the extreme close-up. And not all producers have liked it. One of his early producers said, you can't present a film that's like a butcher shop.
Lugna dig, Märta.
Du kan tala om lugn. Jag har aldrig talat om annat. Jag tror du skulle ha gått med oss allihop om jag hade varit som du. Aldrig bekymrat mig, aldrig ängslat. Aldrig ropat till Gud.
There is a close connection between Bergman's filmmaking and his theater work, and it is a connection that is there from the very start. For instance, the very first play that he staged in an amateur theater in Stockholm was a British play called Outward Bound. And if you read that play or see that play, you notice that it's a story. It's a story about a group of people who board a ship, and they realize gradually that they're heading towards the hinterland, that this is no ordinary journey. They're actually on their way to die. The journey motif there and the implications of the journey is something that Bergman picks up, of course, in The Seventh Seal. But there are also technical similarities, formal similarities between his theater work and his film work. And we have to remember that he has worked in both areas throughout his entire life. The theater influences his film style and that it's very controlled, it's staged. But I also think that there's an interesting use of the camera, that he will give a great deal of emphasis to the actors. He will give a lot of space to the actors. And there are relatively few shots that do not include the intimacy of an actor's body or face, hands, and so on. It is as if we were sitting in a theater watching actors on a stage.
Det var nog bara ugglan i skogsbrynet. Vi har hört henne hela tiden.
We might consider for a moment how Bergman selects and works with his actors. By the time he made The Virgin Spring, a group of theater and film performers had emerged who were referred to as Bergman's stable. Among them were Bibi Andersson, Harriet Andersson, Åke Fridell, Erland Josephson, Gunnar Lindblom, Birger Malmsten, Ingrid Thulin, and Max von Sydow. Many of them had belonged to Bergman's theater cast during his years as a director at the Malmö City Theater between the years 1952 and 1958. Others had worked with him as far back as the 1940s. Still others would join his cast later, for instance, Liv Ullmann. What they all had in common was a dual commitment to the stage and the screen, which meant that their careers matched Bergman's own creative oscillation between the theater and the cinema. His oft-quoted statement that the theater was his wife and the cinema his mistress is only appropriate in the sense that he lived in a happy ménage à trois with both of them. What is really important is his frequent reference to his work as a family engagement or communal affair, where he found or sought to create a sense of comfort and security for himself and for his cast. This might explain the unique rapport that seems to exist between Bergman and his actors, and it could also explain his own sense of sadness when a production is completed, like losing or departing from a tightly knit family group. His cast often seemed to have experienced similar feelings. The American actor Elliot Gould, who played the lead in Bergman's film The Touch, could not understand how the intense and close emotional circle that Bergman had created on the set, how this could suddenly just dissolve once the shooting was over. While working on a film, Bergman ties his cast to him. Harriet Andersson, who lived with Bergman for 3 years in Malmö and was assigned very different parts during her acting career, from Monica, the pouting, sensuous girl in Summer with Monica, to Karin, the schizophrenic woman in Through a Glass Darkly, and Agnes, the dying sister in Cries and Whispers. Harriet Andersson has described her working relations with Bergman as generous and controlling at the same time. In her memoir, she writes that Bergman kept track of everyone in the ensemble or on the film set when they were working on location, even to the point where he put down bedtime hours and had the exit doors locked after going to bed. Even the porch door was locked. Bergman simply forgot, says Harriet Andersson, that he had to do with grown-ups. Ingmar wanted to have us. We were his. The other side of the coin is that this circumscribed closeness between director and actors also created a sense of security and of being let into a special world that demanded great concentration on the work at hand. For though a Bergman shooting was often characterized by a tone of levity between the takes, the work discipline was absolute. The actress Eva Dahlbeck has compared working for Bergman to being enclosed in a garden with a protective fence around the premises. And the actor Gunnar Björnstrand once described his role in a Bergman film like being led by a hand to an abyss, that is, being shown unknown depths, but without losing his footing.
Vallarna bjöd mig att få köpa den. Det är Karins. Det är blod på den. Vad tänker du göra?
Först ska jag sätta järnslån för stugdörren.
Det är redan gjort.
Nowhere is Bergman's fascination with the ritual style of Japanese samurai culture more present than in Ture's preparation for his revenge on the goat herds, even though its content alludes to Scandinavian customs. It is one of the most pictorially self-conscious scenes in The Virgin Spring, and a sharp contrast to the realistic rendering of the rape sequence. Slowly and deliberately, Ture will build up to the moment when he's ready to perform what he has prepared as a sacrificial killing, but which becomes an act of murder and an acknowledgement of guilt. It is in this sequence that the two religious convictions that compete in the film, Old Norse paganism and Christian morality, become most clearly juxtaposed in terms of a single individual and his act. The sacrificial build-up goes through various stages. First is the testing of physical strength, as Ture will fell a birch tree. But before that, he has discovered Ingeri hiding under the stairs. For her, telling him what she has witnessed in the woods is a confession of guilt for having wished evil on Karin. For him, it is a moment of acknowledgement of her guilt and a reinforcement of his decision to execute revenge.
Döda mig först. Jag har större skuld än dem. Jag ville det. Ända sedan jag blev med barn har jag hatat henne. Samma dag som jag bad om det, gjorde han det.
The scene between them bonds them together and is one more instant of how the events in the film tie together the four central characters in different constellations, so that they come to function not only as a narrative unit, but also as a group in terms of moral theme, psychological mood, and emotional rapport.
Jag ville det. Jag hade tagit en sten för att kasta på dem. Men jag släppte den. Och när det var över så slog de ihjäl henne med en båg.
Bergman has said many times that he eats film, and he goes to watch a film in his own studio every day at 3 o'clock. He has also said that it's impossible for any filmmaker, any artist, not to be influenced by his predecessors or by other artists working at the same time. And he has said that it's permissible to steal whatever you need for your films. And so in view of that, it's a little strange that he seems to be disturbed by the fact that he was influenced by Kurosawa in The Virgin Spring. The felling of the birch tree is shot against a wide expanse of horizon with distant dark hills in the background. Ture and the tree become man and nature wrestling in a virtually empty universe. In such an endless landscape, Ture's struggle with the birch tree becomes more than a preparation for physical revenge and showing of human strength. It is the prelude to an act of retribution, dictated by patterns of vengeance deeply embedded in Old Norse culture. But Ture's revenge, soon to be shown in graphic detail, is not viewed as a communal act. Instead, it is an act of murder, for which only he must take responsibility, and this is suggested in his lonely wrestling with the birch tree. Ture's situation is telescoped into an existential moment where the avenger alone becomes accountable for his deeds. This does not preclude the fact that Ture's subsequent killing of the rapists is a just response to their own kind of primitive cruelty, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Preparing for the revenge also includes a purification rite, the cleansing of Ture's body and soul in the sauna or bathhouse, where the birch twigs from the felled tree now serve to both energize his body and be a form of spiritual flagellation. Töre's naked body exposes and confirms his virility. His statuesque appearance makes him at times look like a Michelangelo statue. His bearing and gestures, his slow body movement, and the camera singling out his sculptured face and large hands. All of this brings to mind von Sydow's imposing figure as the knight Antonius Block in The Seventh Seal, who was engaged in a drama of eschatological dimensions as he fought against death himself. The Virgin Spring has an interesting reception history. I've already mentioned how it was received in France and later on in Sweden. I should point out that in Sweden, there was a recognition of Bergman as a cinematic artist. There was never any question of that. But Sweden was at that time, and still is, a very secular society. Now, the situation is quite different in the States. The United States is a Christian, a religious-oriented society. I think that part of the response that was so favorable in the States has to do precisely with the metaphysical themes that Bergman brought up in his films, the very themes that did not interest the Swedes. I did a reception study a few years ago with a select group of people who were watching all of Bergman's films, and I asked them to select their favorite one, and The Virgin Spring was not mentioned at all. In the States, there are two groups of critics of Bergman, one that favors the films of the 50s, and those critics will, of course, include The Virgin Spring, and another group who favors the chamber films of the 1960s and on. All indoor scenes in The Virgin Spring were shot in Filmstaden, Svensk Filmindustris premises in the outskirts of Stockholm. In shooting the interiors of The Virgin Spring, Bergman used, as he had done before, an old Swedish invention dating back to 1919, known as mirroring in, which means that the art director built meticulous models of an original structure, in this case of an old Dalecarlian farmhouse. Bergman's architect, P.A. Lundgren, was particularly skillful at designing such natural-size models. The interior of the farmhouse in The Virgin Spring also bears a certain resemblance to the tavern structure in an earlier medieval film by Bergman, namely The Seventh Seal. Now Töre has entered the hall after preparing himself for his revenge. The interior is dark, like the sorcerer's cabin in the woods, and Töre's stalking movements are as stylized as the old man's display of his pagan relics. Töre's revenge is a premeditated action and a form of ritualized violence. Usually in a Bergman film, it is the emotional involvement and intensity between two parties that lead to aggressive physical action. Or else a sudden irrational snapping occurs within an individual, precipitating a violent but spontaneous attack, such as Alma threatening Elizabeth with boiling water in Persona, or Johann striking his former wife Marianne in Scenes from a Marriage. By contrast, Töre's revenge in The Virgin Spring is filmed like a rather slow and abstracted, almost impersonal ceremony. Carefully and in dead silence, he opens the goatherd's sack and pulls out the stolen garments that belonged to his daughter. He seems to fill himself with her pain, but he contains his wrath until he thrusts his knife into the tabletop. The knife itself is no everyday butcher knife, but more like a decorated short sword with a carved sheath, and a wooden handle formed in the shape of a hoofed goat's head. The ornamentation can allude both to the herdsman about to be killed and to the devil's own goat emblem, or for that matter, to the Christian sacrificial lamb. As so often in the symbolic texture of a Bergman film, the mythical or archetypal implications are suggestive rather than conclusive. The viewer senses a meaning underneath the projected image, but Bergman provides no explicit conceptualized answer. Rather, his purpose is to arouse an emotional reaction in the viewer, not an intellectual thought process. We seem transported into a counterpart of Kurosawa's world of samurai traditions. The result is a tug-of-war between Ulla Isaksson's script, which aims at psychological realism, and Bergman's cinematic style, with its faiblesse for Kurosawa's kind of ceremonious stylization. Afterwards, Bergman himself was critical of his imitative approach, and the film is, in fact, the last one in the Bergman canon where one can detect any direct stylistic impact from other filmmakers. In his next major work, Through a Glass Darkly from 1961, he develops what would subsequently become the epitome of the Bergman style. That is, an aesthetic purity, focusing on the human face, and aiming at developing shadowless gray images and avoiding sharp contrasts and backlighting, a development that was made possible by Sven Nykvist's interest in using new realistic lighting techniques that parted with traditional Swedish black and white photography. The Virgin Spring marks the end of Bergman's classical period, that is, the major films from the 1950s. Though many of these films addressed serious issues, they still provided a mood at the end which conveyed harmony or hope. In The Seventh Seal, the young couple of Joff and Mia survive the Angel of Death. In Wild Strawberries, old Isak Borg is reconciled with his past. In The Virgin Spring, Ture expresses at the end a kind of absurd faith in God. This is a marked contrast to Bergman's films from the 60s, which are much more devastating in their depiction of doubt, pain, and human humiliation. As suggested earlier, Ture's revenge is both cruel and ceremonious. One rapist is stabbed to death the way an animal is slaughtered. The other dies on the fire as if burning in hell. But when Ture grabs the young innocent boy, despite his wife's attempt to shield him, and smashes the boy against the wall, then he oversteps the rules of ancient feuding, where killing and avenging should balance the scales. Instead, he now shares the guilt of the rapists by murdering an innocent and defenseless child. The film has taken great care to show us the boy as a victim, linking him more with Karin than with his elder brothers, who forced him into watching the rape and beat him into silence when he was asleep in his straw bed in the hall. It is when touching the boy after having killed him that Ture realizes that he has broken a code and has sinned. When Bergman first started filmmaking, he was assigned a photographer. He could not choose one. So he worked with a number of them. One was very special. He had a good working relationship with a photographer named Göran Strindberg. But Strindberg had an accident and had to change his professional focus. For many years, as you know, Bergman worked with Gunnar Fischer. But temperamentally, they were very different. And after the making of The Magician, a great deal of tension developed. That's when Sven Nykvist comes into the picture. Nykvist had worked with Bergman earlier, namely in The Naked Night, where he was one of 3 cinematographers. After that, Gunnar Fischer took over for many years. Nykvist is a much more robust personality than Gunnar Fischer. He also had a searching technical mind. One of the unique features of the relationship with Bergman is that they eventually learned a great deal from each other. Bergman could tell Nykvist what he wanted. Nykvist would say, that's impossible to do, and then he would do it. So there are very few conflicts that we know about during their long collaboration. Töre's revenge precipitates the last part of the film, which might be called the atonement. It too is set up in a ritual manner, as in this scene where Töre exits the hall after the killing, and we see his household standing in the farmyard, not busy with their daily chores, but placed more like marionettes in a set theater piece, who begin to move as if directed to do so, and rush helter-skelter in search of Karin's body. They are led by Töre, who has now been established as the main character in The Virgin Spring. His central part is confirmed through Bergman's and Isaksson's decision to move the miracle, the welling up of a spring, from the moment of Karin's death to the end of the film. Doing so is also preferable from a dramaturgical point of view, since in this way we get the climactic and redeeming feature, the miraculous sign, coinciding with Töre's vow to build a church on the same spot as a human response to an act of supposedly divine intervention.
Mer än Gud själv. Och när jag såg att de vände sig mer mot dig, mot mig, så började jag hata dig. Det är mig han vill straffa med detta. Det är jag som bär skulden.
Du är inte ensam, Erda. Och Gud alena känner skuld.
As all take turns to touch and mourn Karin's body, Töre will step aside and fall down on his knees in a scene that constitutes Bergman's most personal part in a film that is otherwise marked by his deliberate efforts to maintain an objective distance to his material. But Töre's prayer that we will hear shortly rings a bell to other such moments in Bergman's filmmaking, such as the night Antonius Bloch's final words in The Seventh Seal after his homecoming, when he kneels behind his travel companions seated at the supper table, who are about to face the arrival of the personified figure of death. Töre's desperate prayer takes the form of a questioning of a divine being who can allow such cruelty as the murder of a child without intervening to prevent it. Töre's prayer, when juxtaposed to his subsequent vow to build a church, that is, to honor God, becomes anachronism, a kind of Kierkegaardian existential vow founded on an quia absurdum est, an act performed because it is absurd. The miracle itself was of special significance to Ulla Isaksson. Her motivation for it constitutes another anachronism in the script. She viewed the spring as an essential Lutheran symbol of grace, though the story takes place in pre-Reformation times. In the preface to her prose version of the old ballad, she writes, The last scene, when Töre kneels and asks forgiveness, occurs because forgiveness is the only possibility. It is also of great importance that the spring wells forth when all need it. In that sense, the film is very Lutheran. That this possibility exists is the very meaning of the film.
Jag förstår dig inte.
But contained in the transplantation of the miracle to the end of the film lies not only a theological question, but a broader religious difference between a universe conceived in terms of total faith and one of subtle meanings and symbolic justice. In the film, writes Isaksson, the spring comes as a poetic apotheosis and an emblem of goodness. In the ballad, it is simply there. God is not only someone who answers when called upon, he works full-time. Bergman himself has indicated that the welling up of the spring was not meant as simply, quote, the tidy expression of a religious miracle. He considered the scene a cathartic necessity. I didn't see how it was possible to allow the picture to end without the spring. For if the father had merely gone home, and there had been a great silence, there would have been no release for the feelings of the people of the story, nor for those of the audience.
Av kalk och sten. Och med dessa mina händer.
Two distinct sources of inspiration come together in this final scene in the Virgin Spring. As so often in a Bergman film, a single individual, in this case Töre, takes on the role of blessing giver, an important religious concept where someone, usually a priest, prays for someone in need. That means that the scene becomes not only Töre's personal statement, but a communal service. Töre's words are like the words of a priest, and his household responds by singing an ancient Christian hymn. It is a healing moment of togetherness. You might again recall here von Sydow's role at the end of the Seventh Seal, anticipating the arrival of death, with his entourage seated at the table as a ceremonial group. Or you might think of Isak Borg's luncheon in Wild Strawberries, when he recites the old Swedish religious poem, while his companions listen, surrounding him at the outdoor table. The communal blessing giver motif appears in a secularized but no less ritual form as late as in the TV film In the Presence of a Clown from 1997, when the apparatus of the cinematic inventor breaks down in an improvised projection hall. Then a member in the audience stands up and haltingly reads a passage from her book. Stillness falls on the listeners while Schubert's music is heard. In all these solemn communal scenes, only a handful of people participate. Think, for instance, of the small congregation in Winter Light when Pastor Thomas intones his liturgical lines. In all these solemn communal scenes, whether they are religious or secular, we have perhaps the essence of Bergman's filmmaking and artistic creed. For to him, the purpose of all art is to be both communicative and participatory, like a mass. Though full of doubt about his own religious background, something which is built into Töre's final words to a God he does not understand, in spite of that, Ingmar Bergman borrows in his art the ritual form in which he grew up as the son of a parson. In doing so, he joins in with those people in the old ballad who danced together at midsummer time around the Virgin Spring at Tjärna, singing, "How can I this deed atone? To God I'll build the church of stone. Gladly shall we do such work. Cold is the forest air. Tjärna shall we call the kirk, when green the trees are there."